Okay, now we're going to be taking a look at Vue's modeling capabilities, specifically MetaBlob objects. And we're going to be modeling a very simple object and a very everyday object, and we're just going to do a doorknob. So I'm going to start out by loading in a sphere, making that just a little bit bigger, and we're going to compress that down. But what we want is the nice intricate curves that we get, uh, or more the lathe curves that appearance that you would see with doorknob. So I'm going to just stretch that out, and then I'm going to copy and paste that, and I'll move it back just a little bit, scale that down, and squish that in, and that way we'll get a nice little edge and rim on that once we metablob it. And we'll be able to control how much influence each one of these objects takes into account once the actual metablob is created. So the next thing I'm going to add now is a cylinder, and I want to rotate this around in the side view, and then just scale it down just a bit. We want to make sure we're about in the center. Right now we're not too worried about it being perfect, but you just kind of want to eyeball it right now just to make that about center. And I'm going to add another sphere and move that to the back, squish that down, pull it forward, and then I'm going to take our first sphere, copy and paste that, and move that one back and squish that down. And then I'll be adding one more cylinder, but I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste this one we've already got in here since it's facing the right direction, and just make that about the same size as that last sphere. So when that rounds off, we'll have kind of the attachment. Now this is sticking out kind of far, so I'm going to pull that in. And we already pretty much have the basic shape of our doorknob, but all these spheres are not connected, and it doesn't look very realistic. So if we want to actually be creating a somewhat realistic looking doorknob, we're not going to be able to just keep it like this. So I'm just going to go ahead, select all these objects, and click MetaBlob. Now we can see in the preview, in both the OpenGL and the preview from the camera, we can actually see that our object is conforming a little bit more to each individual shape and blending itself together, and we have a more interesting looking doorknob and a more realistic looking doorknob. One thing you will notice is that we have this back section really blending into where the door should be, or the handle should be rotating. So I'm going to undo this metablob, and what we're actually going to do is set it up as two separate metablobs. I'm going to do our second metablob first and just do that, and then I'm going to grab the other objects and metablob that as well. And this way we still have a very sharp crease, or we have our object actually going in the other one, and it's going to create sort of that dip and divot. But I do need to go in and actually edit that cylinder a little so that it comes out more, because of the way that it's blending right now, it doesn't really look like it's going into the object, and it doesn't look like it'd be able to turn in it. There's a few other things too for adding detail that we can do to this object. As we can see, our back cylinder in the second metablob, the first one we did, is not quite right, so I'm going to expand our cylinder just a little and actually just go ahead and delete that other sphere we put in there for the blending, because it doesn't look like it's actually helping us at all. So I'll delete that, and that will reblend it into itself without that object, and we still get that nice curve around the edges. So that object was not necessary. But another thing we want to keep in mind is, let's say on the front we have either a keyhole or maybe one of the inside doors where we just have a little hole in the front that you can kind of stick a hanger in and pop that open. So we can sort of base it on that sort of doorknob. And what I actually want to do is cut out that area for where that hole is going to be, that little dip that we have. So what I'm going to do is add one more sphere in here, and I'm going to squish it and just pull it in just a tiny little bit, so it's just going inside that doorknob. And I'm going to be using this as a negative metablob, a negative influence. But first I have to unlink the current metablob that this will be part of. So I'm going to right mouse click and go to ungroup objects. Now it's no longer a metablob. I'm going to take our sphere and drag it up so it's next to our other objects. Hold down Shift and select the top sphere, and then click MetaBlob once again. Now once that's done, we can grab our newest sphere that we added, which is sphere 3, double click, and we're going to create the effect of subtractive, and click OK. So now instead of that sphere adding to it, it's actually subtracting, and it's sort of like a Boolean within metablobs. So we've sort of flattened out that front part of the surface and dipped it in a little. But I can edit this however I want, and you can just go in and size that down if you want, if you think it's maybe too large or too small, and we could squish that in. You want to make sure it is touching the object though, so it does take a little bit into account. So now we just got a little bit of a flat front on there, and I'm going to actually zoom out and move our camera so that it's shining on this object so that we can see it in our preview a little bit better. And what we can also do now is even create one more sphere in there to create that hole, or one more cylinder actually. So I have to actually unlink this again, and you'll find that you'll be ungrouping and grouping these objects back together quite a bit when you're modeling objects, just because once you add that meta blob, you can't really add anything else to it. So I'm going to copy and paste and move this out and scale this down so it's quite small, and stretch it out so that it's penetrating the object. And then I'll go back into our layer editor and just group that with the rest of the objects. Go back and meta blob it, and then select our cylinder and our sphere 3. Holding down Control, you can select the other one, or you can hold down Shift and select it. And then we're going to double click and make sure both of these are set to subtractive, and click OK. So now we can see the front of the doorknob is flatter and then has a little hole in it. So I'll just go ahead and do a preview render that so we can take a look at it a little bit larger. You can see it's coming together pretty nicely. We can also make a few other adjustments. Let's say we wanted to add some screws to this back plate. Well, what we can actually do is create some spheres and create some more subtractive areas. So that way we sort of have the sink-in area where we can put a sort of a sphere to represent a screw, and maybe even cut out a little piece of that sphere so it actually looks like the head of a screw. So we're going to select this back piece here, and I'm just going to ungroup it and add a sphere. Scale this down kind of small because the influence can be quite large sometimes, and just position it sort of on the side. And I'm going to copy and paste this and do the exact same thing on the other side. And these will become on our subtractive objects for our sink-in holes. So we want to select our last couple of objects, go ahead and create a meta blob object out of that, and then we're going to select our last two spheres, which are spheres 4, and double click and set them to subtractive. And if we take a look at our preview render, or just go ahead and render a frame, we can see that that area starts to sink in a little. And you can adjust that however you want. You can make it a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, just so it looks like it's got a place where the metal was created for those screws. And like I said, you can sink them in a little bit. Maybe I'll just move them back just a tiny bit, and then I could even move them inward if I have to, and I'll just select each one individually to move in. And now it's more on that flatter part of the surface. And then if we want to create a screw head, what we can do is go ahead and create another sphere, size that down to about the size of that area that's sinking in, and I'm going to flatten this out and then zoom in, and now we're going to make a small Boolean where I'm going to use a cube, and I'll have to scale that down to match our size so we can see it. And just on the top view, we're going to position where the screw will be and what will get cut out. We'll just make that a little bit longer. and just position that in there. And now we'll select this sphere just after we kind of eyeball that to the center. Select our sphere, and then our new object we just created, and then do a Boolean subtract, which remove that part of the object so it looks like a screw now. We can zoom out, select our difference object, and position it into place, which will be right here. And we want to make sure it's sort of in the object a little. And then what we can do is go ahead and copy that difference object, paste it, and drag it over to the other side. And then once that's done, we can actually go ahead and select all of these objects and just load in I'm just going to load in a preset texture right now. We'll go to metals and select maybe brush gold and click OK. And I'm just going to go ahead and render this to screen, 640 by 480 on final, and we can take a look and see how this turned out. Now this material does look like it needs a little bit of adjusting in order to make it look realistic, but as far as the actual model itself, it looks more like a real doorknob than it did before without using metablobs, and adding the sunken in screws and things like that can really add to the amount of realism in that object. So what you can do is actually just go ahead and save this, and if you ever work on interior scenes, you can just load it in and add it to a door, and that way you have a nice realistic looking doorknob where you've put some time and effort into actually making it look like a real doorknob. And you can go in and edit these different parts of the object. If you maybe want to bring this back sphere down a little, maybe size it so it's not so big and maybe not affecting the front object so much. We could also make this hole in the center here in front a little bit smaller because it does look like it's a little bit big right now. It's about the size of the screws, and it shouldn't be. It should be a lot smaller than that. But we can see the area we cut out of the screw, and that's on both sides. So that's something that would mount it to the door and just add that extra bit of realism. So you can do this with a lot of different ways of modeling, and use this for modeling lots of different types of objects. Because metablobs can be very powerful, and knowing how to control them is very important.